Good morning. Bill Zuersher is here from Los Angeles today, and he's going to be speaking about the belief system we know as Christianity and a little bit of the history to show that it came along from a long evolutionary process. He has a book that's outside for purchase, and he will sign it. And that book deals with a broad range of topics related to Christianity, but this presentation today will focus on its historical evolution. Bill is an activist for the separation of church and state. He studied economics and government at Yale, and then worked for 2 decades in the energy industry before dedicating himself to teaching and writing. His interest in religion derives from a concern about the role of faith-based beliefs in American politics. Rather than engage in public policy debate about multiple disparate issues, he decided to focus on the root cause of all of them, namely religion, and specifically Christianity. He has summarized his own religious views in his debates, quote, "I do not believe in the existence of any gods or goddesses. It is certainly possible that one or more of such beings exist, but if so, they do not appear to expend much effort superintending the affairs of this world." He and his wife, Linda, live in Southern California. It is a pleasure to introduce Bill Zuersher, who is going to give us a very good presentation today. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Gail. Can you hear me okay? All right. Very good. Let's see if we can get the technology to cooperate for us. There we go. I always like to start out with something on the light side. I was told long ago, if you're going to be in show business, never follow a child act. Though those kids were just adorable, so I'll do my best. But that was you've probably already seen the highlight of the morning. As Gil said, I want to talk about the history of Christianity, and let's see here. Just going to. There we go. So the talk is entitled "Christianity: How It Happened." I had intended to keep my remarks on a very elevated intellectual level. Then I saw this picture, and I really couldn't help myself. Is it just me, or does anybody else think this church looks like a big chicken? I love that. I love that picture. The argument that I'm going to put to you today is that Christianity is a human construction. It's human-made. That it went through specific stages in its evolution. That we can look at the transition points between each of those stages and see that they were caused by very naturalistic, historical, identifiable forces. And what's really interesting is that if we read carefully, we can still find the evidence for earlier belief stages fossilized in the Christian scriptures. These are the stages I'm going to talk about: Canaanite polytheism, Jewish monotheism, Apocalyptic Judaism, and then early Christianity. And don't worry, I'll define the terms as we go through. It occurs to me, though, I just want to make a couple of points clear before we launch into this, and I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence. But just as background, it's important to understand, of course, Christianity is very clear that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are one and the same God. Okay? And I'm sure all of you understand that the Old Testament is actually the Jewish Bible, so it's the scriptures of the Jewish people. Then Christians added new writings, which they called the New Testament, put that alongside. So the Old and the New Testament is the Christian scriptures, but the Old Testament is the Jewish Bible. So again, don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence, just wanted to make sure we're on the same page. As I mentioned earlier, the transition between each of these stages was caused by very identifiable historical forces, and I'm going to talk to you about the first transition occurring as a result of the fall of the 2 kingdoms, as a result of the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests. I'm going to talk then about the next transition occurring as a result of Persian, Zoroastrian influence, and finally then the transition from Apocalyptic Judaism to what we would recognize as primitive or early Christianity as a result of Greco-Roman or Hellenistic ideas coming into the mix. So let's take a look at the earliest stage here, Canaanite polytheism. Canaan is the ancient term for what we would call Palestine today. So Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, that patch of the world. And I use the word Canaanite because I want to emphasize the fact that the ancestors of those tribes we call Jewish held beliefs that were originally not much different than those of their Canaanite neighbors. Most relevantly, they worshipped many gods. How do we know this? Well, the Bible tells us so. Many examples of polytheistic behavior. Can I have a show of hands? How many people have read some of the Old Testament? Oh gosh, lots of, okay. Many of you have. So you'll be familiar. These are just a smattering of quotes. The Israelites served the Baals, the Ashtoreths, the gods of Aram, Sidon, yada, yada. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down. In other words, out of all the Israelites, only 7,000 were not worshiping Baal. Then he brought me to the entrance of the god Tammuz. And there are many other passages like that. So the presence of polytheistic behavior among the ancient Israelites is not in dispute. What is in dispute is, well, what's really going on here? The traditional Jewish and Christian explanation is that these were good monotheists who were worshiping Yahweh or Jehovah, but they were being lured astray by these false or foreign gods. I'm going to argue that that traditional understanding is wrong, that they were not monotheists. Rather, they were still polytheists in the very beginnings of the process of evolving toward monotheism. And to support my argument, I'm going to offer three arguments: textual footprints, covenantal logic, and the emergence of omnipotence. So let's take a look at the first group, textual footprints, really reading the biblical text carefully. By the way, I'm going to show you a lot of quotes. I already have. All the quotes I'm going to show you come from the NIV translation, the New International Version translation. I picked that translation because it's popular among conservative Christian evangelicals. I didn't want to be accused of picking an easy target. Right? So I'm using the NIV translation. The comments in parentheses, however, are my research into the underlying Hebrew or Greek, as the case may be. So here we have Abraham's God first names himself. I am El Shaddai. May El Shaddai bless you. El Shaddai appeared to me. El Shaddai means El the mighty, or El of the mountain. Now, these are among the earliest interactions that the biblical patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac, have with the God of the Old Testament. What's with this El Shaddai stuff? Right? Of course, the Old Testament, it's a big book, and God's a hard concept, so maybe they're going to use a lot of different expressions. But when they start referring to the God by the name of another God, you start to ask questions. It turns out that El was the head of the Canaanite pantheon of gods. And this information has really become clear in the last 75 years. In 1929, the Ugaritic texts were unearthed in Syria, and they've given us a lot of background on what the ancient Canaanite belief system was. So their pantheon consisted of El and his wife/consort Asherah, and there are many offspring, including the son Baal. Right? So El was the head of the Canaanite pantheon. Very interesting. Other Old Testament names for its God, when you look beneath the English language translation, are El Elyon, which means El Most High, and Elohim, which is the Hebrew plural form of El. You heard me right? So the allegedly monotheistic God of the Old Testament is being referred to consistently by the plural form of El, the head of the Canaanite pantheon. All of these El names suggest, to me at least, that the God of the patriarchs was in fact the Canaanite god El. If they worshipped El, presumably they worshipped his pantheon and were therefore polytheists. Jeepers, you might be saying to yourself, hold on, where did this Jehovah or Yahweh character come into the mix? Well, later, in Exodus, Yahweh introduces himself to Moses. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh. This is one of the most surprising verses in the Bible. Here the God has to go out of his way to explain that he's the same God who appeared to the patriarchs. It's just that for unexplained reasons, he was going by a different name back then. Confusion about the name of a God is the last thing we would expect as part of a competent revelation. And that's especially so if what we have here is a monotheistic God attempting to educate his chosen people about exactly what monotheism is all about. Okay? So what appears to be going on here is that this verse looks to me like an editorial attempt, a somewhat clumsy editorial attempt, to stitch together two completely different traditions, an El tradition and a Yahweh tradition. The most logical explanation for all of this, here we have a before and after shot, is that previously the ancient Israelites worshipped the Canaanite pantheon, as I described earlier, with El and Asherah and the family. You know, most pantheons are sort of projections of the human nuclear family, so they kind of look like us. And at a certain point, a newcomer deity named Yahweh entered the mix, perhaps introduced by a Moses-like chieftain, a Moses-like figure. Over time, the identities of El and Yahweh were fused into one, and all of the other gods were discarded. Interesting hypothesis, and it's supported by the fact that a lot of you raised your hands when I asked who had read the Old Testament, right? And you'll be familiar with the fact that the Old Testament is jam-packed with polemics against Baal, right? You guys remember Baal's this bad god. You know, you have the scene where, is it Elijah? Elijah who does the competition with Baal, and they winds up killing the priests of Baal, right? There are no polemics in the Old Testament against El. None. Now, El would have been the logical target, right? He was the numero uno, the top dog in the competitive pantheon, okay? So what I'm arguing happened here is that El and Yahweh, their identities were fused. Elements of attributes of El and elements of his biography were fused with those of Yahweh, and they became one God. As the centuries passed, of course, written references to El would have in many cases been modified so that the term El became a generic term for a god or a title rather than the name of a specific particular god. In parallel with that, then what happened is Baal evolved to become a generic term for any false or foreign god. But there's more. Many of you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with these quotes. They jump out at you. They're so unusual. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. This is the creation. Now that man has become like one of us, this is when they're getting ready to boot Adam and Eve out of Eden. Let us go down and confound their speech. This is the Tower of Babel story. Why the plural here? That certainly sounds like polytheism, right? Now, some of the classic responses you might hear, Christians might say, well, this was the three persons of the Trinity talking to each other. I've always enjoyed the ingenuity of that. Who said the royal? Yes, sir. That's another one. That this is merely what they call the honorific plural. You know, when the queen was not amused, said, "We are not amused," off with their head, right? So this could be the honorific plural. The problem with both of those explanations is that if either of those were the case, you would expect the pattern to continue throughout the Old Testament. And it does not. What we find is really only a very few of these quotes in some of the very oldest strata of the writings, okay? I think there's a simpler explanation, and that is that one of the themes that was very common in Near Eastern literature, and we know this from the Enuma Elish and the Ugaritic texts, is this idea of a chief deity presiding over a divine council or a heavenly court. And I think we're seeing some vocabulary from that here, traces, footprints, if you will, of that here. And there are several passages in the Old Testament text where this idea is explicit. This is one of my favorites. The heavens praise your wonders, Yahweh, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can compare with Yahweh, who is like Yahweh among the heavenly beings? The Hebrew is Bene Elim, sons of the gods. In the council of the holy ones, El, it says El. El is greatly feared. He is more awesome than all who surround him. And these are not like typos, right? Because there are some other very good examples which time won't permit us to go into. So this passage raises many questions. The first thing that comes to my mind is if Yahweh were understood as a monotheistic God, why would he need to boast of being superior to other heavenly beings? That need suggests an insecurity, and the insecurity suggests perhaps even a past rivalry. Even more fundamentally, who are these? Who are they talking about? Holy ones, sons of the gods. Well, you might say, well, this is just poetic speech, right? These guys were waxing poetic. I don't buy that, because it seems to me that if you were going to use a metaphor to describe this revolutionary new idea of monotheism, you would find some poetic image that emphasized his uniqueness or his singularity. You wouldn't plop him right back down in a traditional polytheistic setting. That doesn't make sense. Now, another explanation is that these beings are angels. Yep, they're angels. Well, a couple of problems, maybe a couple of problems with that. First of all, the Hebrew word for angel is malach. We don't see that anywhere in the passage. So that raises a red flag. It also raises, this is one of my favorite topics, I talk about this in my book, what I call the problem of angels, which is why would an all-powerful God need helpers, right? I mean, he could perform all of the angelic tasks effortlessly and directly. Not only would that be simpler, but it would eliminate the problem of underperforming and even mutinous angels. So I think what we're seeing here, again, are footprints of a divine council or heavenly court. And we could spend a long time talking about some of these other quotes. They're really very interesting. But so in summary, where does this leave us with? As free thinkers and skeptics, perhaps we're not surprised to come to the conclusion that, well, the biblical text is contradictory. There are multiple passages that support monotheism. There are multiple passages that support polytheism. But that's really curious when you stop and think about it. I mean, why so few passages trumpeting monotheism? This is a revolutionary idea. Arguably, the most important idea in history. It is the foundation of Israel's identity and its gift to the planet. Okay, so the paucity of these monotheistic statements and the continued presence of polytheistic statements suggests a very long twilight of polytheistic beliefs within the culture. Later editors could make adjustments to the texts, but they could never completely eradicate the footprints of these earlier beliefs in the scriptures. Let's jump on to the second reason for supposing that the early Israelites were polytheists, and this is the covenantal logic, the logic of covenant. The idea of covenant is one of the most important ideas in the Old Testament, right? In the Mosaic covenant, the people forswear other gods in exchange for Yahweh's favor. But when you stop and think about it, this whole idea of striking a bargain between a deity and a people makes more sense under polytheism than under monotheism. I mean, under monotheism, what other gods would the people need to forswear? Right? They're fictional. And I would draw your attention to the wording of the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. It doesn't say there are no other gods, right? It presupposes the existence of competitive gods. Moreover, a monotheistic God would not have to negotiate. He would not have to offer most favored nation status in exchange for allegiance. He could simply dictate terms. And finally, there's no reason why a monotheistic God, and certainly an all-powerful one, would need to just pick one people. He could communicate with all the people on earth simultaneously. Why would he choose? It doesn't really even seem moral for him to choose one people and favor them. And he did favor them, right? According to the biblical stories, he promised the Israelites the land of milk and honey, and he provided them with supernatural assistance in exterminating its former occupants. So again, covenant makes more sense under polytheism. Finally, the third reason for suspecting that they were polytheists is the gradual emergence of omnipotence. I've got a couple of quotes here, but before you read the quotes, I want you to think about this, right? Under polytheism, you can't have omnipotence, right? Because if one God is all-powerful, then there's no power for the other gods. You kind of have to, monotheism and omnipotence kind of have, I guess monotheism would be the prerequisite for omnipotence, would be a way of saying it. Well, the Old Testament God certainly was not omnipotent. I got a couple of fun stories here. The first one, many of you will be familiar. This is the famous iron chariots. Quote, "The Lord was with the men of Judah, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron." Right? So the all-powerful creator of the cosmos got licked by some guys with iron chariots. Not really confidence-inspiring. The second story is less well known. The king of Moab took his firstborn son and offered him as a sacrifice. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew. You have to read this carefully. So what was going on here is that the prophet Elisha had predicted that the Israelites would defeat the Moabites. So they march on Moab. There's a big battle. And the king of Moab, Mesha, takes his son and slaughters him as a sacrifice to the Moabite god Chemosh. Okay? Now, read what happens. The fury against Israel was great. They withdrew. So the Israelites got beat. Right? So, at least according to the chronicler of this tale, the sacrifice to Chemosh was effective. Chemosh and his people defeated Yahweh and his people, at least on Chemosh's home turf, because polytheistic deities tended to have associations with specific pieces of geography. Okay, so omnipotence really wasn't feasible until you had true monotheism, and we can see indeed that there really was not omnipotence early on. So in summary, I've offered three arguments for why the Israelites were polytheists, okay? Textual footprints, covenantal logic, and the emergence of omnipotence. In sum, the evidence suggests that the early Israelites were an indigenous Canaanite people with beliefs very similar, if not indistinguishable, from those of their neighbors. If that's true, then we can read much of the biblical history as useful creations of later generations. So, for example, the Exodus, right? This might explain why there is zero archaeological evidence for the Exodus. So you had over 2 million people wandering in the desert for 40 years and leaving zero trace. And this is despite the best efforts of American, European, and especially Israeli archaeologists. The Israeli archaeologists want to find it because this whole story is their divine deed to the land, right? So they're very keen to find the evidence, and they found nothing. I remember the first time I went camping, and an old experienced camping hand said, "The sign of a really good camper is he doesn't leave any evidence that he's been there." So these guys must have been awesome campers. So it doesn't appear that the Israelites fled from Egypt in an exodus. It appears that they were in Canaan all along. Okay? Exodus appears to be a foundation myth which served to legitimate later beliefs such as chosenness and separateness. All right, so what was then the turning point? Because the Jews certainly eventually did become monotheists. Well, a little bit of history for those who might be a little bit rusty. Right after the golden age of David and his son Solomon, the kingdom of the Jews split into two parts. The northern part, the larger, was Israel. The southern was Judah. In 722, the Assyrians attack and obliterate the northern kingdom of Israel. Those people are sometimes known as the lost tribes of Israel, right? Because they've just disappeared from history. 150 years, Judah hangs on. Finally, in 587, the Babylonians conquer Judah, and they haul the elite of Judean society off to Babylon to be slaves. So this is known as the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian exile. No doubt, while in Babylon, many Jews gave up on Yahweh, perhaps concluding that he no longer cared about them, or that he was not as powerful as the gods of their conquerors. But some Jews in exile developed a radical reinterpretation of events. Here's how they reasoned. Why were Israel and Judah defeated? They're being punished by Yahweh because they were insufficiently loyal to him. Oh, so the Assyrians and the Babylonians are Yahweh's instruments. That's right. Yahweh's punishing them through history. Wait a minute. If that's true, Yahweh must control the Assyrians and the Babylonians as well. He must be the one God who controls everything. So we see an emerging, like a planetary consciousness here, this idea of really stark monotheism, one God who's controlling all of human history. And we finally see that stated explicitly. I was talking before about how disappointed I was about the lack of monotheistic statements. Well, here we finally have it. This is the prophet known as 2nd Isaiah, and the dating of this writing is approximately 540 BCE, at the end of the captivity. Emphatic singularity, at last, I call it. I am the Lord and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I form the light and create darkness. I bring prosperity and create disaster. Notice the devil, there's no devil in here. We'll talk about that in a minute. I, the Lord, do all these things. There is no other, yada, yada, yada. Turn to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth, for I am God. There is no other. Emphatic singularity. We finally have what we would consider classical Jewish monotheism at the close of the Babylonian captivity. Let's move to the second phase. So we're going to, among these Jewish monotheists now, they believe in one God, but they don't have a heaven and a hell, at least in the sense that we understand them, and they don't have a devil. Now that might sound strange. Let's take a little bit of time to think about that. I call heaven and hell sort of a differentiated afterlife. We're all accustomed, because Christianity has played such a dominant role in our culture, to think of, well, good people go to one place and bad people go to another place, right? That's kind of the Christian teaching. The Jews classically did not have that. They did have heaven, but heaven is where God lived. Hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive, 1 Kings 8:30, right? People didn't go there. That was just where Yahweh hung out. So what happens when you die? Well, you go to Sheol. Okay? Here's a quote from Job, which I like because it annoys people. As the cloud fades away, so whoever goes down to Sheol does not come up. That's Job 7:9. Now, you might be scratching your head. This is strange stuff. I've heard of this Sheol. Sheol was physically located under the ground, and people in Sheol persisted in a sort of a disembodied and semi-conscious state. It was the end of any kind of meaningful experience, not much, if any, pleasure or pain. But here's the significant part about Sheol. Everybody went to Sheol. Good people went to Sheol, bad people went to Sheol, Jews went to Sheol, non-Jews went to Sheol. That was where you went when you were dead. That was the classical Jewish understanding. Wait a minute, Bill. If that's the case, how does this God, Yahweh, how does he mete out rewards and punishments? Well, rewards and punishments come in life. From Deuteronomy, if you fully obey the Lord your God, abundant stuff, fruit of the womb, young livestock, crops, right? Thumbs up, good stuff. If you do not obey the Lord your God, waste, disease, plague, computer viruses. So at this stage of development of the religion, God punishes and rewards in life. Right? There's no mention here of reward or punishment in an afterlife. And I'm going to argue that, I'm going to show you evidence that this frustrated the God. This really frustrated the God. Check out this verse. God does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. Right? So you do something wrong, your children, your grandchildren, and if I can do the math correctly, your great-grandchildren are punished. This is what's known as the doctrine of intergenerational sin. I can tell from your reaction, most of you agree with me, this is a sort of a morally repugnant teaching. But it's not a typo because it's taught in 3 other passages in the Old Testament. So you got to think about this. Why would a God resort to making a threat like this? Let me put the question more precisely. Why would a God who had a differentiated afterlife at his disposal need to resort to making a threat like this? The obvious answer is he didn't have a differentiated afterlife at his disposal. Once you died, you were in Sheol, game over. He couldn't get at you anymore. So, and I think that is why the authors of these ancient texts made their God out to be like a member of the mafia threatening innocent family members, right? Because he had insufficient leverage over you. That's the basis of intergenerational sin, I would argue. So there's no differentiated afterlife in terms of a heaven and a hell for rewards and punishments in this classical Jewish monotheism. What about old Beelzebub? God said to the serpent, because you have done this, you will crawl on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life. I'm sure you guys recognize what's going on here, right? This is the old talking snake episode and eating the fruit. It's not an apple, by the way, it's a fruit. It was represented in a lot of art as an apple, but it's a fruit. The Christian interpretation of this story is that the snake is, or the serpent or the snake is the devil, or Satan. I'm going to argue that the Christian interpretation makes absolutely no sense. First of all, the text doesn't name the snake or the serpent. It's just a talking animal, an animal of fable. If you read a Christian study Bible, there'll be a footnote, and it'll say, "Oh, that's Satan, that's the devil." But that's not in the text. That's a Christian. I'm going to argue that's a retrojection onto the text, backward in time. So here's the thing, right? So the text says that the God punishes the snake. But why would the God punish the snake? If the Christian interpretation is true, okay, the culprit was Satan impersonating a snake. But the snake didn't do anything wrong. The snake was a victim of identity theft here, right? Why didn't the God punish the real culprit, Satan? According to the story, he punishes snakes. And I would argue that the fact that the presiding deity punishes the poor snake here is proof that there is no Satan at all in the story, that's all a later projection or an interpretation by Christianity. Now, Satan does appear in the Old Testament. This is one of the most well-known examples. Here we have the Lord said to Satan. So this is when Yahweh and Satan make this bargain. They're going to torment Job just to see how he responds. And it must be a true story because we have a picture here of Job. So the Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." It's interesting. I want you to note here that Satan is not in opposition to Yahweh here. Yahweh gives him very strict guidelines to follow, and Satan follows those guidelines scrupulously. So it turns out that the Hebrew word Satan means an adversary or an opponent or one who obstructs. And it occurs in 9 passages in the Old Testament. And in none of those 9 passages is he a supernatural opponent of God or of Yahweh. How do I know? Well, I'm going to show you all 9. But don't worry, they go quickly. Of the 9, 5 of them take place in a completely earthly, terrestrial context. All right? But now the Lord, my God, has given me rest, and there is no adversary. The Hebrew is Satan, or disaster. Right? So this is Solomon musing about the fact that, okay, we're at peace. I can finally get about the business of building the temple. Then the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Satan, Hadad the Edomite. Okay? Send the man back, or he will turn against us, become an adversary. Here it's a verb form. You have perhaps a general oppositional idea here, but in no sense is there an opposition to God, an opposition to Yahweh. let's look at the next four. The next four instances of Satan occur in an otherworldly context. The angel of the Lord, remember I said malach was the Hebrew word for angel. Malach Yahweh stood in the road for an adversary, again, a verbal form of Satan to oppose him. You guys know the Balaam story, by the way? This is so great, right? Because we were talking just a moment ago about the talking snake. So Balaam, this will only take this a momentary aside. So Balaam decides he's going to go someplace Yahweh had told him not to go, right? So he's riding his donkey, and all of a sudden this fiery angel stands and blocks his path. But the cool part of the story is that Balaam can't see the angel, only the donkey can see the angel. So the donkey rears up and refuses to move, and Balaam is kicking the donkey and saying, come on, get going. And here's the really cool part of the story, right? So at this point, the donkey starts talking to Balaam. The donkey he looks back and says, hey, why are you hitting me? Haven't I been your faithful donkey all these years? And of course, at this point, the scales fall from Balaam's eye, and he can see the fiery angel, and he beats a hasty retreat. So there is, just for trivia, there is a talking donkey in the Old Testament as well. This is a famous quote, by the way, because it's it's complete contradiction to 2 Samuel, which says that Yahweh incited David to take the census. Fun quote. Notice the second two. We're beginning to see perhaps the personification of an oppositional principle here. In the third and the fourth examples, it's ha-satan. And the Hebrew word ha is the definite article the. So it's the adversary. So it's not even the name of a specific being. It's someone playing a role or acting the part. All right? So this whole idea of a supernatural opponent to Yahweh is really not present in the Old Testament. Well, how do we explain what happened? Well, where did we left the Jews? They're still in Babylon, right? So 587, they get hauled off. Around 539, the rising Persian kingdom under Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon, and Cyrus had this policy of emancipating people that had been enslaved. And so he actually sponsors the Judahites to return to Jerusalem. He actually gives them financial assistance to rebuild the Second Temple. But for the next 200 years, Judah is a Persian client state. Okay, they exist at the pleasure of Persia. And I'm going to argue, I can't prove this, but I'm going to argue that there was significant ideological influence from Persia, and specifically from the predominant religion of Persia, Zoroastrianism. Let's take a quick look. Okay, we're going to do a semester of Zoroastrianism here in 30 seconds. The big idea behind Zoroastrianism is that good and bad are locked in a ferocious, titanic struggle for control of the cosmos. Okay, Ahura Mazda is the good god, Ahriman is the bad god. They're two independent principles. Ahriman is sometimes referred to as Angra-Mainyu. He's got a couple of names. And eventually, by the way, this is why one of the reasons Zoroastrianism is places a lot of emphasis on moral teachings, because the view was that every human decision with a moral dimension added weight to one side or other of the scales in this cosmic struggle. However, the good would win eventually. The good guys are going to win, at which time there would be a resurrection and a judgment. People who were good would be admitted to paradise, and others who failed that test would be hurled into the pit. It's interesting, in fact, the oldest reference that we know to a general bodily resurrection comes from the Zoroastrian scriptures called the Avesta. Very interesting. But look at what we've got all of a sudden. If you've been following the story, jeepers, all of a sudden we have a differentiated afterlife, paradise and the pit. We also have a supernatural opponent to the good God. Right? So I'm going to argue that apocalyptic Judaism arose under the influence of these ideas. Apocalypse it's a Greek word which means a revealing, specifically a revealing of God's power and righteousness. And this whole idea of apocalypticism was really, it's what's called a theodicy. Theodicy is a fancy word to describe how do you deal with the age-old problem. If God is good, why is there so much bad? Okay, it's an age-old problem, but let's face it, we still haven't figured that one out. But there's a possible answer here, because cosmic dualism enables you to blame all the bad stuff on the bad powers, right? So the struggle is ongoing. But then you have to ask, well, why are the bad powers doing so well? I mean, why can't we, kick their butts? And the answer is that, well, it's only temporary. Soon, there's going to be an apocalypse, right? The good God will intervene, defeat evil, abolish suffering, and inaugurate a new age. So all these beliefs were stirring around in the first few centuries BCE, and these were ideas that I would argue were heavily influenced by the kind of Zoroastrian beliefs we just discussed. This weird slide is a print from a wood carving. It's supposed to represent Daniel's dream, and the book of Daniel is the latest book in the Old Testament to be written. It was written around 165 BCE during the time of the Maccabean revolt, and so Daniel has these dreams of these beasts coming to attack the world, and the fourth beast is about to destroy the world when the Ancient of Days defeats this fourth beast. And he appoints as his viceroy on earth, quote, one who is like the Son of Man. So if you're a gospel reader, you might recognize that kind of phrase. So this is a very late writing, around 165 BCE. And this was very much in the mind of Jewish thinkers around the turn of the millennium. I've got some famous apocalypticists here. Time is short. The world in its present form is passing away. That's Paul. Here's Jesus himself. The kingdom of God has come near. John the Baptist, I love this image. The axe is already at the root of the trees, right? Now, I know I'm among skeptics. Many of you might not think that Jesus and John the Baptist were actual people. That's fine. The point is here that the New Testament writers, Paul and the authors of the gospel, were reflecting apocalyptic expectations. Something big was going to happen soon. Well, then what happens, right? So in 322, Alexander the Great conquers the Mediterranean basin, and Palestine is then governed by his generals, his successors, because he dies young, and then the Romans afterward. I'm going to argue, this is a big topic, and I'm going to simplify it by just talking about three very specific points. Points, I would argue, points of influence that the Greco-Roman thinking had on emerging Christianity. I'm going to talk about mystery religions, the Logos, and the destruction of Jerusalem. So, mystery religions, raise your hand if you're familiar with this term of mystery religions, sometimes called mystery cults. Not too many, okay. These are really cool. First of all, in the Greco-Roman world, religion was a very complicated affair. You had all sorts of stuff going on. You had the classical pantheons. You had new religions that were being introduced from the far-flung extent of the empire, right, sort of flowing into Rome. You had ancestral deities and local spirits, like lakes and groves of trees had spirits. Then you had the imperial cult. The emperor was supposed to be, was apotheosized, deified. So it was all very complicated. Mystery religions were a part of that. And what was unique about mystery religions is that you joined them by choice. All right? You weren't born into it, or you weren't affiliated as a result of your family. You had to be initiated into them. And there was often quite a bit of secrecy around that. That's one of the reasons we don't know as much as we would like to about mystery religions, because of the secrecy. Why were they secret? Well, number one, in many cases they were outlawed because they were felt to be subverting traditional civic views. And secondly, The initiation experience was experiential. It wasn't really something that you could just sort of tell somebody, here, read this essay, it'll change your life. You kind of had to go through the initiation process. And apparently, what was at the core of these things was this idea of a ritual imitation of the god in order to participate in the triumph of the god. Okay, that really is the core idea. So some of the examples of this would be, the five big ones are Isis and Osiris, the Egyptian originated ones. Dionysus, they're perhaps the oldest. The Eleusinian mysteries, which celebrate Demeter and her daughter Persephone. And then Mithras and Attis from eastern, western Turkey, Anatolia. Those are the five most common mystery religions. I've got a couple of quotes here. On this lake they hold an exhibition of the god's sufferings. They're referring to Osiris. A performance the Egyptians call the mysteries. And this is Herodotus writing 440 BCE. Plato, I conceive that the founders had a real meaning, that he who arrives there after initiation and purification will dwell with the gods. I show these quotes because often Christian apologists will say, oh, well, the mystery religions took those ideas from Christianity. And I wanted to put a stake in the ground to demonstrate that, well, these things are much older than Christianity. At least most of them are much older than Christianity. Some, but not all of the mystery religions were based on the vegetative cycle. Right? So this remarkable thing, right? A plant grows and it dies, and next year it comes back again. Right? So this process of growth and decay gets symbolically reinterpreted as the promise of an afterlife for human beings. So examples of this were Osiris and Dionysus, the Egyptian god Osiris, the Greek Dionysus. They were both killed by being dismembered, okay, which can symbolize, if you want to take the symbolism to this level, can symbolize the threshing of the grain. Osiris was associated with grain, Dionysus with grape, right? So the threshing of the grain or the trampling of the grapes can be symbolized from the death of the god, right? And then Osiris was resurrected. Dionysus was not resurrected. He was actually reborn, and then he descended into the underworld to retrieve his mother and successfully ascended. And he later became a guide for those making similar journeys. This is really cool. You can go, this is a fresco from what's known as the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii, Italy. And you can walk around, and this is just one of 7 or 8, these big frescoes. And it's only been open to the public for the past couple of years. For the past 2,000 years, it's been covered in ash since the eruption. We don't know exactly what's going on in these things. We're pretty sure this is Dionysus right here, sort of voluptuously lying back on some unidentified female figure. This is the symbol of Dionysus, was this sort of spear with a pine cone at the end and had ivy. It was a phallic symbol. So that was the symbol of Dionysus. So that's how we know who that was. So what would happen in these again, we don't know as much as we would like to know, but what would happen apparently is that the initiate would undergo some sort of scary experience, which was intended to mimic either death or a descent into the underworld. And then there would be a rebirth or a return. Okay? Now, this is very important. I'm not claiming that Christianity got the resurrection idea from the mystery religions. Remember, I just said that came from Zoroastrianism. Okay? What I'm suggesting happened here, though, is that the mystery religions helped the early Christians think about what a resurrection might mean. Remember, the core of these mystery religion ideas was participating in the God's triumph through ritual imitation. And we actually see something like that in the earliest Christian writings, those of the letters of Paul. Don't you know that all of us who are baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were therefore buried with him through baptism into death. If we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. It's interesting for those gospel readers. For John the Baptist, baptism was a washing away of sins. For Paul, that's not what he's talking about. For Paul, baptism is a ritual identification with the death and resurrection of Jesus. And what's really interesting is that this idea does not appear to be part of traditional Jewish thinking. This idea of incorporation, participation in the God's triumph. I'm arguing that that was an idea he took from the mystery religions. Now, the challenge for Paul, who is a well-educated, he may have been a Pharisee, they were very well-educated, conservative Jews, is how does he reinterpret traditional Judaism in order to accommodate this new idea of mystical union with the triumphant God-man. That seems like it's a completely alien thing. So he undertook this ambitious exegesis or reinterpretation of the Jewish scriptures. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what he said. He said this, well, Jesus had to die. Why did he have to die? Well, he had to be sacrificed to atone for humankind. Well, wait a minute. Why was atonement necessary? Well, atonement was necessary because human beings are incapable of following the law that God gave to Moses and so on. Oh, that's interesting. Why were humans incapable of following the law? Well, that's because Adam and Eve's original sin polluted us. Jeepers. Can you see how far Paul had to re-engineer in the back office in order to accommodate this new idea in the front office? He had to go all the way back to Genesis and reinterpret the whole story. So what he was basically saying is, the Jews had treasured their scripture for 1,000 years. He's basically saying, well, up until now, up until I came along, you guys didn't really understand what you were talking about. This is really what it's about. And time doesn't permit. He went through an elaborate, there are arguments that he brings forth, and there are arguments that are based on scriptural, close reading, exegesis. I'm going to argue that Paul's arguments don't hold water. Let's start at the bottom and work our way back up. How about this idea about original sin polluted humankind? I'm going to argue that that's not a teaching from the Old Testament at all. Here's my argument. Yahweh never heard of original sin. Why? Why do I know that? Check out the flood story, right? Yahweh gets angry and he creates a flood and he wipes everybody out, except Noah and his family. But Noah and his family were descended from Adam and Eve. Consequently, they were carriers of original sin, right? Had Yahweh known about original sin, he would have known he had to kill Noah and his family too and start over completely. I mean, this is checkmate. The God of the Old Testament didn't know about original sin. All right? So I don't find Paul's argument about original sin very persuasive. What about Paul's argument that we were incapable of following the law? Well, the God of the Old Testament believes otherwise. Here we have a quote from Deuteronomy. It's Moses speaking to the people on behalf of God. And here we have Paul's paraphrase of Deuteronomy. Look what Deuteronomy says. What I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It is in your mouth and your heart, so you may obey it. Here's Paul's paraphrase. The word is near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart. That is the message concerning faith we proclaim. Notice in the original quote, the law, it's very clear that the law is intended to be obeyed, and you humans are capable of obeying it. Paul omits those points at the beginning and the end, which make those aspects of the argument clear. So again, I don't find Paul very persuasive. We're going to cross that one off too. What about Paul's argument that atonement is can only be achieved through sacrifice? Well, actually, the Old Testament teaches alternatives. If my people pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will forgive their sin. Check this one out. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. And there are many other examples. So long before the time of Jesus, the Israelites had developed the view that there were multiple routes to atonement with God. Most importantly, repentance and prayer. Sacrifice was part of the picture, but it wasn't the whole picture. Christianity, though, right? This is the clever part. Christianity needs sacrifice to be the only way. Why? Because if it's not the only way, then you don't need Jesus, because Jesus was the sacrifice. So Paul's trying to say only through sacrifice, i.e. Jesus. And the text doesn't really support him in that. So that's not really very persuasive. And that leaves us with this idea of mystical union, which again, as I mentioned earlier, he does not try to support through close reading of the text, exegesis, because I submit that idea is not really present in the Hebrew Scriptures. That's a mystery religion idea. Okay, so none of this really makes sense. He's asserting this. He's got proof texts, but the proof texts have problems, as I have just demonstrated. But remember, Paul was taking his message to the Gentiles, right? Many of the Gentiles, they respected the Jews for the antiquity of their religion and the piety of many of their followers. But they would not have had an in-depth knowledge of the Jewish scriptures, so they wouldn't have identified problems like we just did. And this whole mystical union idea may have been something that they were very comfortable with, because they would have been familiar from the standpoint of mystery religions with that very idea. All right, let's move on now. So that's mystery religions. Let's take a quick course in philosophy. I want to talk about the logos. You guys remember this term? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word, right? This is the beginning of the Gospel of John. Couple of interesting things to note here, right? First of all, how does the author of John know any of this? He wasn't there, so he has relinquished any pretense to historical reportage here. But what's really interesting is the word word in Greek is logos. And it turns out that logos has an older history and a broader meaning. If you go back 500 years, Heraclitus, you guys remember your philosophy 101, right? So Heraclitus was this Greek guy who said you can never step into the same river twice because the water's moving. So everything is in flux, but it's nevertheless governed consistently by this underlying rationality. And he named that rationality logos. Fast forward a couple hundred years, the Stoics believed that the logos was this sort of creative energy that sort of flowed through otherwise inert matter. But the most interesting of all was this guy Philo. Check out the date, 40 of the Common Era. So he was pretty much a contemporary of Jesus. He was an Alexandrian Jew who tried to synthesize Greek philosophy and Judaism. And he had this idea, he took from Plato this idea of the perfect realm of unchanging forms, and he contrasted that with the realm we occupy where everything changes and deteriorates and degrades. It's imperfect. Gosh. And he said, well, surely there must be a buffer between the two, because otherwise the imperfect realm would contaminate the perfect realm. And he named that intermediate state the logos. In fact, so the logos was something between God and creation. And he in fact, in one of his writings, he actually referred to the logos as God's firstborn son. Very interesting idea. Now, so why am I talking about the logos? I'm going to argue that the logos argument was very useful for helping to avoid the accusations of polytheism, right? So think about it. Jesus was a Jew, his followers were Jews, so a bunch of Jewish guys hanging out, and they have already got a God, right, Yahweh. But some people want to say Jesus was divine. Now, if you do some math, if Yahweh's a God and Jesus is a God, I'm getting a little nervous here because I'm counting two gods. So there's a little problem here, and I'm going to argue that the logos was very useful for early Christology. That is, this nature of, what exactly is Jesus? You guys know where the word Christ comes from? A couple of you do. So, in the olden days, when a new king or high priest took office, he would have his head sprinkled with ceremonial oil, and this became known as anointing. And the Hebrew word for anointed is Messiah, And the Greek word for anointed is Christ. So Jesus Christ means Jesus the anointed, or Jesus anointed. And I'm going to argue that this logos concept enabled the early Christians to sort of dodge the polytheism accusation. Because as the logos, Jesus was sort of in this unique category of being. He was kind of in between, and it's all hard to understand because God's ways are a mystery. You know, some arm waving in there. So it enabled them to sort of put that thought out. Now, the earliest Christian writings have this idea. The earliest Christian writings are Paul, and Paul had this idea that Jesus was this vaguely defined supernatural being who came down to earth. Doesn't say much, but the writers of the Gospels, those who are interested in the life and ministry of Jesus, seem to have had a very different point of view. For some of them, Jesus appears to have started out as an ordinary human being. I just want to take you quickly through that. The first gospel to be written is the Gospel of Mark, even though they put Matthew first. So a couple of things to note. First of all, in Mark, Jesus appears as an adult. Okay? There is no genealogy, no nativity story, no virgin birth, none of that. Okay? This suggests that nothing out of the ordinary had previously occurred. Certainly if the author of this writing had known about a virgin birth, it doesn't seem likely he would have left that out of the story. That's a pretty cool story element to include. So nothing out of the ordinary had happened. When he preached, those around him thought he was, quote, out of his mind. Again, if Jesus had been born, in the crosshairs of a miraculous navigational star beam, or if he had spent days coaching the priests at the temple precociously, these are all things that were later added by Luke and Matthew. If any of those things had happened, people perhaps would have expected something unusual from this guy. Further evidence that there was nothing unusual. Then he goes to be baptized, right? Okay, and for John the Baptist, as I said earlier, baptism is a washing away of sin. Well, if he were divine, why would he have sin that needed to be washed away? That doesn't make any sense. As he's being baptized, here's the key quote. He saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending upon him. The phrase Spirit descending upon him suggests that the Spirit was absent previously. So in other words, what's happening here is he is being adopted by God at this instant in time. Okay? So this Christology is known as adoptionism. And it's likely that many of Jesus' earliest followers were adoptionists. And in fact, there's some evidence we can talk about later that there's some textual evidence that adoptionism was suppressed in favor of other more sophisticated Christologies. If we jump ahead, now we're talking around 80 to 90 of the Common Era. Matthew and Luke, these are the first writings to claim a virgin birth. So what's going on in the 80s, right? So at this point, the Jesus movement was initially all Jews. It's now getting, as more and more Gentiles are entering the movement, it's becoming a predominantly Gentile movement. And of course, many of these Gentiles would have been familiar with the virgin births of other God-men in the Greco-Roman world. They may have expected and demanded that their new God-man have an equally auspicious beginning. The baptism is de-emphasized, but there's still no indication of a prior existence. So in Matthew and Luke, unlike Mark, when Jesus becomes divine at his baptism, in Matthew and Luke, because of the virgin birth, he's divine from conception or from birth. So we're kind of working our way backwards. Then finally we get to the fourth gospel, and this is the one I began by quoting. It's the last and theologically most self-conscious. And of course, for those of you familiar with the Gospels, it's very different from the three earlier, the synoptic Gospels. Lots of differences. For example, the three earlier Gospels have a lot of exorcisms and parables. Those are largely absent in John. John has new material that heretofore not seen. The washing of the disciples' feet, the woman taken in adultery, the doubting Thomas cycle, all that stuff is in John, but it's not in the other ones. But most importantly for our purposes is that divine dignity is maintained throughout. Jesus does not go to be baptized at all in the Gospel of John. We'll have none of that. And nor does he go to the desert to be tested by temptation, as he does in the three earlier Gospels. So here, Jesus is divine eternally. He is the Logos. Let's take a look. So we set out to explain how Christianity came about by going through a variety of stages and undergoing a variety of transitions. And the point I want to make with this slide is now you can see that each of these transitions, as time has flowed by, has deposited new ideas. So the first transition deposited emphatic singularity or true monotheism. The second deposited differentiated afterlife, a devil. I might also add a looming apocalypse, which never transpired, of course. And finally, as apocalyptic Judaism was influenced by Hellenistic ideas, this idea of mystical union and logos Christology, there's one final decisive act in the Greco-Roman drama, and that is the destruction of Jerusalem in around 70 of the Common Era. And this is a very big event. So around 66 or 67, fighting broke out, inspired by religious and political grievances between the Romans, who were the overlords, and the Jews in Palestine. And the war culminated in the utter destruction of Jerusalem. I think it was 6 legions went in, and you can read it's gruesome stuff. You can actually read the description in the historian Josephus. He talks about blood running down, just blood covering the streets. Terrible stuff. You can still see this arch. This is from a detail from the Arch of Titus in Rome. And you can see it's soldiers bringing slaves and booty back from the conquest of Jerusalem. You can see the menorah there from the temple. Why is this so important? Why am I going on here? Well, remember, you have Jesus. Jesus was a Jew. His followers were Jews. They were based in Jerusalem, right? It's likely that James became the head of the Jerusalem church after the death of Jesus. James may well have been Jesus' brother. We can get into that whole thing later. But it's very clear, if you look at the book of Acts, that James and Paul were at loggerheads. I mean, the book of Acts does its best to paper over the conflict, but it's really clear that these guys couldn't stand each other. And what was at the root of the problem was that James believed, and the Jerusalem church apparently taught, that in order to be a follower of Jesus, you had to be a Jew first. Of course, it goes without saying. Jesus was a Jew. We're all Jews. Of course you've got to be a Jew. I mean, that goes without saying, right? Paul didn't really care for this, as we know from Paul's letters. So with the utter destruction of Jerusalem, the arguments of the Jerusalem church became a moot point. Okay? Christianity was now property of the diaspora. So Paul's argument, Paul's message, that faith and baptism had replaced the law and circumcision, was perfectly positioned for the Gentile market. Christianity was now something completely separate from Judaism. And with its openness to everybody, its emphasis on proselytization, and its promise of a triumph over death, it was poised to radiate throughout the empire. So I hope you guys have lots of questions, because that's a lot of material to cover in a very short time. But that, my friends, is how it happened. Diane, are we going on for questions for a while? Okay. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes. Oh, we've got the mic.
I'm interested in how the church had selected various gospels. From what I understand, there were many gospels, and the church seemed to pick the ones that they wanted to use. How did that come about?
Oh boy, great story. So the question was, there were lots of gospels floating around. How is it that the church selected the gospels that they chose. Great question. By the way, I've got an advertisement in here. And I do talk, my book is divided into two pieces. I talk about doctrines and evidence. And I do talk about the development, the historical development of the canon. The canon of the New Testament was not really finally decreed until about 392 of the Common Era. So it was a 400-year process by which the canon was hammered out. There were lots of Gospels, and by and large, the four they chose were among the earliest. So they were looking for the stuff that was closest, and they were also looking for. They had four tests. Could they link it to an apostle? Was it universally accepted by the church? I can't remember what the other two were. They had these tests, but they didn't follow the funny part. And I talk about this in the book. They didn't really follow the tests very religiously. There are some writings that were written earlier than some of the things that were included, but they were excluded for mysterious reasons. The short answer is that it was based on an emerging tradition, but it was a political process as well. One of the Gospels that was very popular and it was used by a number of early Christian churches was the Gospel of Peter. And I talk about this in the book. There's a hilarious scene in the Gospel of Peter where instead of finding the tomb empty, Jesus emerges from the tomb, but he emerges with the cross. The cross of the crucifixion comes out, and a voice booms down from heaven, "Have you preached to those who are asleep?" And Jesus doesn't say anything, but the cross chimes in, "Yes." So yeah, very interesting stuff. So I think maybe they made the right decision in excluding the Gospel of Peter. Yeah.
Any other questions?
I had heard a lecture many years ago, and I don't recall his name, but he gave an explanation of Jesus' virgin birth and why Jesus never got married. In the Jewish religion, a mamzer is a bastard, has to marry another mamzer, and therefore Jesus never got married. And I was wondering what you thought of that explanation.
Okay, so if I understand your question, that's very interesting. You're linking the questions about the legitimacy of his birth
Yes.
to the fact that he never got married.
Yes.
Excellent thought. There is, of course, the virgin birth is a huge. In fact, I have another presentation on the virgin birth. It's a huge topic, and one of the possible explanations is that it's a response to an illegitimacy tradition. You don't really need to go that way, right? Because virgin birth stories were pretty popular, so you don't really need to point to the illegitimacy question as a driver for the virgin birth. But you're right. It would have been very unusual in that time and place for a 30-year-old man to be unmarried. Of course, the traditional Christian response is that he was married to the church.
You know, that was just another response I heard several years ago.
Yeah, that's a very interesting linkage. I hadn't put those two thoughts together. And the fact that there's a whole other chapter to be told about, there was this old Woody Allen line, right, about he concluded that Jesus was pretty well adjusted considering he was an only child, right? But there are a number of passages in the Gospels which indicate that he was not an only child. He had brothers and sisters. So then a cottage industry arose to explain who these brothers and sisters were. And Protestants will tend to say that they were Joseph's offspring from a previous marriage. Catholics will say that they were actually cousins, that they were other offspring of Zechariah and Elizabeth, who were Elizabeth, who was the mother of John the Baptist, was Mary's sister. This all came about after the Gospels were written.
But Orthodox Jews do get married at a very young age.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And I talk about this. Mary would have been 14 years old. I mean, there's a wonderful painting by Fra Angelica of the angel of the Annunciation, and it shows the angel appearing to Mary, telling her. Of course, it's a contradiction because the angel in Matthew the angel comes to Mary, but in Luke the angel comes to Joseph. We won't get into that. But it's a wonderful painting because Mary seems to be enthroned in this chair, and the angel seems to be bowing before her. But if you zoom in and just look at Mary, you can see that this is a frightened 14-year-old girl. It's kind of a poignant story, actually. You know, to be 14-year-old and have, that's quite a message to get. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have any details on the assertion that Exodus was written in Babylon?
Can you repeat the question? Yeah.
Do you have any details on the assertion that Exodus was written in Babylon?
Oh, written in Babylon.
Yeah, during the exile in Babylon.
I don't have specific information on that. I'd be interested if you've seen some research on that. But
There's the PBS show about 8 years ago that went in looking at archaeological evidence for Exodus, and their assertion was that it was a mythology created during the Babylon exile to inspire the Jews to go back to the Holy Land.
Yeah, well, I think that's perfectly consistent with my argument that it was a foundation myth, okay, which served to legitimate the specialness of the Jewish people.
I was wondering if you had any archaeological evidence of that.
I'm sorry?
If you had any archaeological evidence of that.
Oh, right. Well, because there's zero evidence in the Sinai Desert, so there's no evidence that an exodus ever occurred. That 2 million people.
What
were
about
ever there.
evidence in Babylon?
Oh, they were. Oh, are you asking? Is there evidence that they were in Babylon?
Well, there's evidence that there is, but there's evidence that the book of Exodus was written in Babylon.
Oh, no, not that I'm aware of. I don't know how you would prove where it was written. That would be pretty
The
tough.
records, Babylonian records.
Okay. Are you familiar with Babylonian records?
No, that's what I'm asking you.
No. I don't think that would be a real smoking gun. I'm not aware of that. Yeah, that would be super. I'd love to find that. Whoops.
Yes, you mentioned that the elite of Israel were taken to Babylon.
Yes, sir.
What did you mean by that? That not all the Jews were taken, and what happened to the ones that were not taken?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of your basic decapitation strategy, right? If you want to reconfigure a society, you take all the political, military, religious, scientific, educational elites away, and the rest of the society, you know, they're not really interested in these geopolitical affairs. They're just farmers trying to eke out a living, and they're not going to represent an ideological threat to their new overlords. So rather than, you know, extirpating the entire society, it's far more economical just to take the ringleaders out and enslave them, and then you can govern peaceably the remnant that remains.
I'm interested in your references to Satan, and I thought you said that was about the time of the Persian influence, because there is a word in Persian that's shaitan, which is like somebody who's bad or naughty. And I wondered if the language actually came from Persian to use that word.
That's interesting. I don't speak Persian.
I do, that's what I meant.
Okay. Well, my argument is that the word Satan was a Hebrew word, and that was in use a long time ago, but that later on it came to take on the meaning of a supernatural opponent. That was a Christian retrojection onto the meaning.
There may be no connection at all. It just occurred to me because I happen to be familiar with it.
Do you speak Persian?
Yes.
Wow, and say the word in Persian.
It's shaitan.
And
They use it often for little children. You know, if they're being naughty, they call them
Okay.
shaitan.
Very well, I know the feeling. Okay, so very good. Thank you for that. Yeah, Gil.
Regarding the legacy of the Greeks to the beginnings of Christianity, is Socrates credited with the notion of eternal life?
Oh, great question. Well, of course, there are questions within questions there. So most people believe, or most scholars believe, that Plato's early dialogues were reflections of what his teacher Socrates had taught, and that Plato's later dialogues tended to be more of Plato's own ideas. But if you read the Phaedo, it's very clear that Socrates, in fact, the existence of a soul he doesn't question that at all. The only thing that's at question is the soul immortal? And Socrates is teaching the immortality of the soul in that dialogue. Yeah, this is a very complicated question. Jews, and I say tended, to have the view that personhood consisted of body and spirit together, and that they had to be integrated. That's why Christianity is kind of saddled with this idea that there has to be a bodily resurrection. I talk about that in my book. There's lots of ways to make fun of that, right? Whereas the Greeks had this idea of a soul being imprisoned in this imperfect matter, right? And that the soul was perfect. And for example, Plato would say that the reason we can understand mathematical proofs, for example, is that because our soul is recognizing from previous direct acquaintance with the perfect, unchanging, eternal forms, that our soul used to be there and now it's temporarily captive in these sort of dirty, material, earthly world. So yeah, it would be a very big topic. I can't possibly do it justice, but there was a smashing together of these two different views of what personhood was, and the Christian interpretation of body and soul, you can see, is a little bit of a hybrid between the Jewish idea. It's more Jewish than Greek, but it was influenced by Platonic thinking.
Yeah. So are you trying to say that mathematics is the original virtue?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, we're starting to veer away from anything I tend to be knowledgeable about. But yes, Plato said that in the world of the eternal forms, mathematical truths, goodness, truth, and beauty were ultimately one. Now, I don't ask me to explain how he got that. Yes.
First of all, I just want to say that I've seen and read many presentations like this over the years, and I just want to say that yours today is about the most thorough presentation I have ever been part of, so I want to applaud you on that. I'm going to buy the book and send it to a conservative Christian friend and just hope that he reads it. Hope and pray that he reads it. But I'm very curious about a quote in the back of your book.
Okay.
By you, and I'm just curious to know why you decided to include this. You say, "I do not believe in the existence of any gods or goddesses. It is certainly possible that one or more such beings exist, but da-da-da." So I'm just curious to know why you felt you chose to say it is certainly possible that one or more such beings exist.
Yeah. I call myself an atheist and an agnostic, by which I mean I don't believe and I don't know. So I'm in both camps. The book is a critique of religion in general and Christianity in particular. I don't really get into, does a generic supernatural being exist? The argument that I make in the book is that, well, I make lots of arguments in the book, but basically I say that the difficulties with Christianity can be put into 5 broad buckets. I say it's arbitrary, it's human-made, it's already been disconfirmed, it's illogical, and it's immoral. So I kind of put, all of the arguments can be put in those 5 buckets. In order to make those arguments, I don't really need to get into the stuff that really makes my head hurt about a prime mover and the Big Bang and the origin of the cosmos. Those are all fun questions that I enjoy discussing and debating, but I don't consider myself having the answer there.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
All right, yep, I
I've-
think that's,
I've
I think
heard-
that's good.
I personally appreciate that honest humility, that we cannot prove that there is no God, but we have no evidence that we can rely on that there is. So
Yeah, thank you.
we
I mean,
stop there.
I guess-
I call it personally, and I think we could all probably, or a lot of us could take that position. Philosophically, we're agnostics. Practically, we're atheists.
Very nice,
That's-
very
so
nice.
One question over here.
Yes.
How did you decide to write this book?
Oh, how did I decide to write the book? Yeah, it's interesting. I was not raised in a particularly religious background, and but I'd always been I studied economics and politics, and always been interested in government and public policy. And I was actually in an earlier career, I did a lot of traveling, and I lived abroad for a number of years. And I came back to the United States after a number of years abroad, and this was during the time when George W. Bush was president. And I was taken aback by the extent to which religious vocabulary and ideas had sort of permeated the civic discourse. And I became really discouraged by that. So I started researching that a little bit more. And I'd always been interested in ideas like the teaching of evolution and prayer in school. I'm interested in education. And it occurred to me that, well, you know, rather than focusing on one particular public policy issue, what if I can find the root cause of all of these problems? And it seemed to me that the root cause of this, and at the time it was very much evangelical Christianity. You could argue that with the defeat of Ted Cruz by he who shall not be named, represents the cresting, knock on wood, maybe the cresting of evangelical influence in the Republican Party. I don't know, but I thought I can make a contribution here by focusing on the root cause of the problem, which is dogmatic faith. And that's what I wanted to attack with the book.
Yeah, this is sort of indirectly a question to you. I got the impression that there was a sort of like a statement equating the non-ability to prove the existence to God with their non-ability to prove the existence of God. But doesn't this make the error, you know, there's this idea in philosophy called the onus of proof that falls upon the person making a positive claim. I mean, the question is, how does something that does not exist leave any evidence for its non-existence? So it's never possible to prove something does not exist. Like, you know, I think Bernard Russell came up with the cup flying around the universe. How would you prove that doesn't exist? You can only prove that something exists.
You're preaching to the choir, sir.
Any other questions? All right, the noon hour has come. Join us in the room 2500C on the cafeteria, just next to the cafeteria, for lunch together. Thank you all for coming, and another thank you to Bill for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.